And now another protest is held in the U.S. over the death of a black man, Jordan Neely, who was killed by a white former Marine in New York. The protesters chanted justice for Jordan as they gathered outside the Manhattan District Attorney's office on Friday. They called Neely's death an act of lynching, likening it to the murder of George Floyd by white officers in 2020. Neely, a mentally ill homeless man, died on Monday. A video circulating online shows a former Marine holding him in a chokehold before he faints and later succumbs at a hospital. A New York medical examiner has called his death a homicide. However, the Manhattan District Attorney has refrained so far from announcing any charges against the Marine involved in his death. And now joining us for our news review program is Colin Campbell, Press TV correspondent, joining us from Washington, D.C., and Gerald Horn, professor of African American Studies, joining us out of the University of Houston in Texas. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both to the program. Colin, we're going to start with you. Colin, there are reports that this gentleman was belligerent and a little bit erratic, but we both know that this doesn't justify what happened to him. What do you know about the story you can share with our viewers?
Well, right now, one of the most important things to note is that the man who allegedly killed Jordan Neely has not been charged. He was released by police, and that's why protesters are so upset, and that's why many people are so aggravated at what happened to Jordan Neely. Now, of course, people say that there are lots of people on the subway. Every once in a while, you get people who might seem that they aren't totally cognizant of what's going on. They may be belligerent, they may be annoying, they may be pestering. But one thing that I think goes beyond the limit is a type of vigilantism. And that's what it seems like this this Marine, U.S. Marine, 24-year-old U.S. Marine who has not been identified, has engaged in a type of vigilantism. And it's also very troubling that as this Marine put Neely in a chokehold, two other people were holding down Neely's arms. So essentially, it was like a lynching. It was like just murdering someone on the subway, right? And I think that's what's most troubling about this, is that no one's been charged in it. We do know that Neely was known to be a Michael Jackson impersonator, someone who other people have described as homeless. So he was already facing adverse situations. This is not a person who was just having a bad day and decided to take it out on subway passengers. This is someone who has been dealing with lots of difficulties along the way, and it did deserve to be treated with some kind of respect. But what we're seeing here is somebody who was on the subway, apparently enraged another passenger, and that passenger put him in a chokehold, and Neely later died. We also know, we have to remember, these chokeholds have a precedent of leading to death. When we know about Eric Garner, who was killed by a police chokehold several years ago, and many more cases, but probably the most notable one is when Eric Garner was killed by police using a chokehold. And now we see another young black man being killed by a type of vigilantism, which we have seen with the Ahmaud Arbery case, which we've seen with the Trayvon Martin case, with Zimmerman in Florida. So this is something that continues to occur, and I think that people are just frustrated over this. They're tired of it, and they want to see some justice.
Thank you, Colin. And Professor Horn, welcome to the program, sir. Now, Professor Horn, I'm sure we've all seen people out in public that suffer from mental issues. I have on a street corner, or up and down a sidewalk when their schizophrenia or one of their issues kicks in and gets hold of them for a few minutes. Last thing we think to ourselves is to restrain that person, or even if we think that, last thing we think from there on is to take that person's life. Why do you feel charges have yet to be brought against this young Marine?
It's important for your audience to realize and recognize that it's not coincidence, it's not happenstance that Mr. Jordan Neely happens to be black. That is to say, when watching how he was murdered, it reminded me of the bad old days of slavery. That is to say, when black people were treated so shabbily and so atrociously. And we also should not see it as an irrelevant detail that the accused murderer has served time in the U.S. military, has had 2 overseas deployments. when I read that, I was thinking perhaps he was deployed in Afghanistan or Iraq. Perhaps he learned that chokehold in Afghanistan or Iraq. Or perhaps he even used that chokehold against Afghanis or Iraqis. Also, we should see that Mr. Neely having this mental episode is a reflection of the fact that the United States has very poor social welfare measures, which is one of the reasons why it has one of the largest homeless populations in the world in this apparent rich country. And likewise, a disproportionate percentage of those who are unhoused, who are homeless, happen to be Black. It's also clear that the United States, as presently constituted, is incapable of dealing with the foregoing issues. I think it's incumbent upon our friends in the international community to raise this question at the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, at the General Assembly of the United Nations in New York City, because we should also recognize that, as I just referenced, the fact that the accused was deployed overseas, there is a connection between this kind of brutality that the US military exercises overseas and the kind of brutality that it exercises at home.
Thank you, Professor. And Colin, we can't help but to touch, and I hate to get into redundancy, but white privilege here. We've seen white people with mental health issues and police taking meticulous time trying to talk them down. And we see exactly the opposite when an African American suffers from a mental health issue. It's always draw for the weapon first and ask questions later. And there's just such a discrepancy there between I understand this guy's not a cop, but he is a veteran. He could have handled it completely different. Had the tables been turned around, what kind of public outrage do you think you would have seen if there's a Black gentleman choked out a white guy on a subway to death because he had a a mental meltdown?
Yeah, we probably would have seen subway passengers intervene and try to stop the Black individual from trying to subdue the white individual. We have seen cases where many police officers who have killed unarmed Black men have been acquitted on charges, but when a Black man shoots a white person, a Black police officer shoots a white person who they believe to be a threat, we've seen that person be sentenced to several years behind bars, several years in prison. So we've seen the reverse. I think that there is some interest in the grand jury hearing this case and seeing if there should be charges filed. And I think that's what many people are looking forward to as police are asking for people to send any type of video, any type of footage that they may have of what happened. Because again, this is a type of vigilantism. We have a veteran Marine who knows how to kill. So it's very hard to imagine that he didn't know what he was doing when he put this person in a chokehold. I'm sure there are other ways he had been trained to suppress or to withhold someone without putting a lethal move in place. And so therefore, it raises the question as to why this person was released, wasn't charged instantly, as we know that if it was, like you alluded to, if the role was reversed, this person would be at least held, charged, possibly released later, we don't know, but they probably would have been charged on the spot, knowing that this person died as a result of the actions of the person who was the aggressor in putting another person in a chokehold.
And Professor, is it safe to say at this point this gentleman may be charged, but that's really up to residents of New York to pour out in droves and show outrage over this? Like we said, had it been a Black person doing this to a white person, chances are he would have already been charged. But he hasn't. We shouldn't negate the fact that there's still a good possibility this man may get charged, but it's really going to come after public outcry, isn't it?
Public outcry indeed. And this incident happened to take place in New York City, a city in which I used to reside, which has a very militant population, has the largest Black population in the United States of America. They're accustomed to demonstrating, they're accustomed to putting pressure on the authorities, and I'm also afraid to say they're accustomed to these kinds of incidents. And I dare say that the kind of street heat, to use the term that's often used in New York City, that's going to be deployed against the Manhattan District Attorney, speaking of Alvin Bragg, who happens to be Black himself, by the way, will inevitably, I think, lead to charges against this accused Marine who should not be allowed to get away with murder.
All right, gentlemen, thank you both for joining us on the program. Stay safe, both of you. That was Professor Gerald Horn there joining us, Professor of African American Studies there, joining us from the University of Houston, Texas, and Dr. Colin Campbell, Press TV correspondent there, joining us from Washington, D.C. And viewers, this brings us to the conclusion of this segment of your Press TV News Review program. Hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned, and bye-bye for now.